Right, Ludo, I'm off, mate. There's a new World of Warcraft expansion out, so I'm going to go into hibernation for 6 months. Alright, see you later. Man, the future of MMOs looks so bright. What's this? Oh. Shit. Yeah, there's more of the same. Oh. Are MMOs a dying genre? Because overall player numbers seem to be in a freefall. Now, it's difficult to get concrete data on all of this, but after some sleuthing, it seems like even the Titans might be slumping. Final Fantasy XIV's player count has fallen below 1 million players, with fewer and fewer players actually returning. Elder Scrolls Online hit a peak of over 3 million players in February of last year, and just 2 months later, sank as low as 87,000. Similar things can be seen for Guild Wars 2, MapleStory, and even The King, World of Warcraft, hit its all-time peak in 2010 at 12 million players during Wrath of the Lich King, but over the years, it has seen considerable decline, now roughly garnering between 7.5 and 9 million players as of late, which is why all of this is dumb. Tracking player counts and using that as evidence for a game or genre's failure makes it incredibly easy to just cherry pick the data that supports your argument of a game's death. Games in this genre see dips because they're live services that have lulls in content delivery and therefore dips in player counts. Yoshi P, the game director of FF14 himself, says to go play other games while new content is cooking. They have large swings of players coming back every expansion because it's an ebb and flow. FF14 is still going strong. The same for Guild Wars 2, ESO, and especially World of Warcraft. They're all killing it in the numbers department. Even if we take the lowest of our examples with Elder Scrolls Online, do you realize how many games would kill to have 87,000 concurrent players? And wow, as in, oh gosh, not as in Warcraft. If you think making $900 million a year from subscriptions alone is dying, sign me up for death, mate. Lower me into the ground right now. Because other studios and publishers would do unspeakable things for numbers like this, and more importantly, the amount of money that these numbers bring. They all want a slice of that pie, but cutting a slice ain't as simple as it seems. Yep, that would have been a good place to put a pie sponsor, but we've never been sponsored by a pie company yet, alas. Speaking of missed opportunities, many companies have tried to take the MMO reins, either in a vain attempt to dethrone WoW or carve out their own niche, but as we've seen over the last 20 years, nearly all but a select few crumble at the first hurdle. WildStar, Final Fantasy XI, the original Final Fantasy XIV, Arcade, MapleStory 2, and in recent memory, New World, and most damningly, Ashes of Creation. Like a lot of our previous examples, Ashes was an MMO that was funded on Kickstarter, asking for a suspiciously low amount of money for the type of game they claimed they'd deliver on. Early on, things looked promising until it released into Steam Early Access to little fanfare, but instead vitriol from dejectors and initial supporters alike. Rumours then began to circulate that Ashes of Creation may have been a potential scam from the outset, then its creative lead left the project, citing a faceless board for all of its failings, leading to the entire project being shut down and its developers being let go. Now, this gets even messier with multiple lawsuits in the works with accusations of embezzlement, fraud, and threats of bodily harm being thrown around, but was this all a scam from the outset? Oh, relax, mate, tweren't accusatory, it tweren't. If anything, I just kind of feel bad for the developers caught in the crossfire of all of this, as they were clearly just trying to make a great game, but that opportunity was taken away from them due to mismanagement on either end. But unfortunately, this is just one example of many. So why do so many games in this genre slip up and break their necks while taking their first steps? Well, it turns out creating an online role-playing game that is simultaneously massive and multiplayer is a complex balance that requires multiple things to align perfectly for them to even have a fighting chance of succeeding. For one, MMOs are exceptionally expensive to produce. If anything, they might be the only genre that requires AAA resources. You can get a wildly successful single-player FPS from an indie dev, but you are not going to get the next big MMO from a solo dev. As much as I would love to see that, it would take them decades to make anything that could compete, and we've just seen the closure of a similar project with Dreadmist, with the dev having to step away from him. Unfortunately, it's in the name. You can't make something massive massive unless you've got massive resources. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars with hundreds of developers, and because of that, they're a huge investment, not just monetarily, but in time. But let's say that you do have the money and time to fund development of an MMO, which a lot of big publishers do. After all of this investment, how can you be sure people will be interested? Well, a cheap and common way to get players on board would be to attach it to an already established IP. Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Warhammer, Dune, Elder Scrolls, or originally Warcraft. Many of your favorite fantasy and sci-fi titles have had their name attached to a proposed, failed, or current MMO, for better or for worse. Now, I mentioned how this is cheap in the sense of tactic, but not cheap in terms of licensing and added development time, because licensing a popular IP can be extremely expensive and comes with a boatload of baggage. Developer friends of mine who have worked with the big name IPs, Star Wars, say the amount of back and forth they require is disgusting. You come up with a unique gameplay system or character skill that will add a lot to gameplay, well, that might not fit the brand's vision of the established setting, so it has to be run up the chain for days on end for you to finally receive a polite "get fucked." Hence why a lot of IP-reliant MMOs tend to be underwhelming or lack polish, because so much dev time is taken up with this bureaucratic bullshit, or they naively believe that the IP will be enough to get players interested in the game, but in reality, you need a unique selling point. What, you have a really good USP, do you? Well, why don't you take a crack at making your own indie MMO yourself then and see how that works out? Well, in fact, you could use today's sponsor.
This video is brought to you by GameMaker, the friendly indie game engine built for beginners and professionals alike. Making your own game can seem like a daunting venture, like trying to eat a movie theater hot dog in the dark. But thanks to GameMaker's project-based learning resources, even a novice can create games from start to finish, increasing their coding proficiency along the way. The GameMaker YouTube channel hosts a variety of step-by-step guides to help you craft your first RPG, platformer, puzzle game, and more. You can also find written tutorials on the GameMaker website. Reference the GameMaker manual for additional tips and tricks, or consult fellow devs in the GameMaker Discord server and at community meetups. Why, it's just like adding glow-in-the-dark mustard to that sneaky little hot dog. Whether you're an experienced programmer or just starting out, GameMaker has all the right resources to make sure you relish your game development journey. Head on over to the link in the description and bite into game making today.
So, what was your unique selling point then? What, animal companions, so you're just going to make an MMO that was nothing but hunters? Fucking gross. Anyway, a USP is something that all new MMOs need if they don't have a juicy IP attached. These can be as complex as a completely unique battle system that breaks the chains of tab targeting, or as simple as being free. The original Guild Wars USP was simply the fact it didn't charge a monthly subscription, which opened itself up to a part of the market that valued that specifically. That's what attracted me to it when I was younger, and I'm sure many of you are the same. The question is, would Guild Wars have survived if it didn't have that kind of USP to get players in the door? But nowadays, it's hard to find a truly unique selling point in a genre that is so oversaturated, not in terms of the amount of successful games in the genre, but how many years the successful ones have been active. Because even individual expansions for established MMOs need USPs, and they're all fighting for player attention, so most of the truly unique things have already been done. But let's say, just for example's sakes, that you've been successful in doing all of this. You've spent the last half decade or more using your infinite money from investors, making your IP-rich, unique selling point monster machine. You've got no issue getting people in the door, but now the real-time problems begin. Because MMOs have a balance problem, not with their stats, but with their players. They're so heavily built around their player base to even function. Think of Guild Wars 2's open world events or Elder Scrolls Online's group dungeons. If there are no players to fill those activities, at best your world feels empty, and at worst, those activities are completely unplayable. The fewer players you have overall, the more this issue compounds, causing more and more of your player base to just find other things to play because the queues are so long, making this issue worse. This can also be seen with faction imbalance in PvP-focused MMOs, or in most of their ever-important trade markets where supply and demand just fall off a cliff. The lower your initial launch numbers are, the greater chances of this player base imbalance is going to impact your game's day-to-day activities, which just sucks. But let's say that you've been successful and you've been running a healthy MMO for years now, well, a new problem arises when attempting to attract new players into the genre. Remember that episode I made about how a game having too much content can be extremely distracting and kind of repulsive to new players if you don't onboard them correctly? Well, now scale that up over 2 decades worth of content with its own set of mechanical and narrative baggage. Now, there are multiple ways to handle this. The first would be to force players to play through your entire story and don't let them access anything in regards to the current content till they're done with that story. This is what Final Fantasy XIV does, and it took me personally over 350 hours just to finish the story. The next way of doing this would be to fast track players through scenarios that give them the gist of the story and get them caught up and doing relevant content with the rest of the community as soon as possible, like what World of Warcraft is doing now with its Tome of History. This counters the imbalance problem a little bit as it pushes the player base into similar play brackets sooner rather than later, but also skips over a huge part of the game's story and, by association, its history. Both of these methods attract and put off different types of players, but these players do have one thing in common. They're all sweaty ass nerds. I sweren't accusatory, it's a fact, because MMO players are a very particular type of person, and when they see a new MMO, they're all asking the same question. Why would I invest in this game? Not just from a monetary standpoint with multiple expansions and monthly subscriptions, but also in the time it takes to play them. Weeklies, dailies, leveling, gear grinding, learning encounters. Also, you need mates who are playing it, which the above category of player is commonly lacking, by the way. Sweren't! If all of your friends have invested thousands of hours and have 20 plus years worth of mounts, transmogs and memories in a specific title, a new MMO's USP or IP pull has to be monumental. We're talking like a black hole to wrench you away from what you are already playing. Regardless of quality, why would you leave what you already have to come try something new? Most developers don't have an answer to that question, and do you know what? Fair enough. How could they compete with these titans when these titans can't even compete with themselves? For each added expansion to an existing MMO, developers need to innovate and create new USPs to entice returning players, but innovating in any meaningful way is difficult when you're using an engine that's decades old, requiring you to place another plate of spaghetti bollocks nays on top of the others. So the question always comes up, well, why not just make a sequel? This is a thing that the Guild Wars team mentioned in their 20th anniversary documentary. Their original Utopia expansion for the first game had so many good ideas and radically different elements that it made more sense to take them and form a new game out of them. It worked out for them in the end, but in general, this has its own drawbacks. I actually remember back in the day that my Guild Wars 1 friends said that they didn't want to touch Guild Wars 2 because it looked too much like WoW, and they thought they'd lose everything they had in Guild Wars 1 because of this. Well, is that true? No, but it feels as such. A lot of people build their lives around these games, and the thought of transferring to another one is unthinkable to them, regardless of whether or not the proposed new game is a sequel to the one they loved. So instead of an outright sequel for MMO devs, it's better to overhaul the foundations of their already established game, which is extremely difficult, by the way, but it allows them to make mechanical adjustments easier in the future in an attempt to reel returning players back in and simultaneously make the game more palatable to new modern audiences, while keeping them in the same world that these players know and love. This can be seen with the housing system in World of Warcraft, which apparently was an absolute nightmare to implement, but gives them a springboard for new features in the future. We're actually seeing something that is going to make me feel a little bit sick to say, but I think it's a good thing. The beginning of the Fortnitification of MMOs. They're transforming the game world into a hub for players to hang out in that gives them access to a slew of different activities to suit a wider range of players' tastes that grow beyond the sweaty hardcores. And for example, in WoW again, we now have mini pet battles for the Pokemon crowd, we have housing for that decoration peeps, we have solo delves for the solo players, raids, PvP, and they're adding a prop hunt game mode to this expansion for fuck's sake, and that is an incredibly smart move. I'm all for creating more ways for different types of players to have fun within these games, as long as it makes sense for the game's identity and doesn't neglect the player base that made them popular in the first place. I don't want to be doing dungeons with Will Smith or collecting mounts with Homer Simpson. That actually might be the death of the genre. But what do you think, mate? What do you think is the driving force keeping the MMO genre alive, and why do so many others fail to even trip past the starting line? Let us know down below, because we would love to discuss this with you. Alright, Ludo, wake up, mate. It's time to say goodbye. Ludo. Okay, what? Bye, guys. You gotta wake up. Come on.